Yo, what's good? Quickly David, Clique Prime Minister. Just to introduce the clip that you're about to see, where we go into the inner workings and philosophies of Clique and how to make poetry content for the modern age. I just wanted to let y'all know that please follow Poet Life Podcast. That's the Poet Life Podcast that we were featured on and just dropped this week. So be sure to follow Poet Life Podcast. Watch the whole interview there. We go into the inner workings of the Clash, of Off Page, how we ideated most of these things. But what you're about to see shows pretty much our entire paradigm on what it takes to make poetry entertaining, because art is to entertain as well as to inspire. So taking that philosophy of making poetry entertaining so that it becomes more sticky for the mainstream audience to get hip to poetry. So yeah, without further ado, Poet Life Podcast clip, check it out.
We're competing for attention, essentially, is what it is. Because when you look at advertising, I come from an advertising background, and we are competing for everyone's eyes. We're competing for your clicks. We're competing for your impressions. So my poetry video, if I upload that on YouTube, is in direct competition with any other video on YouTube. And this comes from a philosophy of what's called search and satisfy. So are you familiar with search and satisfy?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. But to the people who aren't, we'll just re-explain it to everyone else. Mm-hmm. Search and satisfy is a posting philosophy in which YouTube is the second largest search engine in the world, only second to Google itself, right? So people will go to YouTube to search for like how to bake a pie or how to program OBS to stream Twitch, stuff like that. They'll search for those things. Mm-hmm. So when you do that, you're hoping that your content gets picked up by the algorithm, and there's a lot of different things you can do with that. What we're trying to say is that by presenting poetry in a very engaging way that fits those digital spaces. There's a way to post specifically for YouTube using search and satisfy. There's a way to post to Instagram specifically by cutting for those 30-second bits, 15-second bits. There's a way to post for Instagram stories, for TikTok, whatever medium have you. There's a way to properly speak to the room. And that's speaking to tailoring your content for those spaces. So on Twitter, it's typically text, right? And they have their own Twitter InSpeak. So does Reddit, so does Facebook, whatever, right? So to post hour-long videos on Twitter doesn't speak to how the room wants to consume their content. Yeah. Posting a bunch of tweets in a slideshow on YouTube, that's not how they necessarily want to receive their content. What we're saying is we're trying to use our media skills and our production skills to package poetry in the best way possible for those spaces, competing directly with other forms of content. And hopefully when people see poetry presented in a dope way, we will win their attention and we'll hopefully get more fans of poetry and just increase the community and culture.
Yeah, and just to tie those together really quick. So what David's describing, because it's not that you're competing with these other media outlets or styles or anything like that, right? What happened is in the American culture, in the paradigm of art in America, all of those things, poetry got pushed to a very specific place. And it got put in this very specific box. And this is the way that Americans think of poetry. And this is the way that Americans experience poetry. And what we had was an urban revolution, right? That started in the earlier this century. So you have early American Black writers, and then you have the beat movement, you have the Harlem Renaissance, you have all of these things that culminate in hip hop and spoken word and all of what's happening right now. That said, the American paradigm doesn't understand what poetry has grown into, doesn't understand what it is. The average American has no idea. I grew up going to a Mike and Dim Lights, celebrating its 20th anniversary next month. JB and Best Kept started that venue 20 years ago. JB, the DJ, he's amazing, just important DJ, those DJs that you grow up listening to that shaped who you are. Best Kept is a deaf poet. He's family to the community out here. That to say, you grow up in these communities, in underground hip hop, in spoken word poetry, and you see the diversity and the dynamic of what's happening, right? And I realized very early on that the mainstream audience, the American, the average person, has no idea that these poetry events are as dynamic as they are, that they're as entertaining as they are, that they're as exciting as they are. So what happened was, and what David describes is 60, 70 years ago, with the advent of new medias, poetry got kind of left by the wayside, right? And it wasn't taken along with music, with all of these other storytelling forms. So now we're in a place where poetry has the potential to compete because of the content. So we can compete with these people. Brandon just proved that. God bless Brandon Leake for putting in that work, because Brandon just showed the whole country, or reminded the country, because Shihan and DPL and Def Poetry did that for our generation, right? Now we have this other example of, again, somebody taking the paradigm that exists in America and showing something outside of that. What we're trying to do, what our mission is if we make content that falls in line with the same media standards as movies, TV, all of these other things, then people can see it, they're going to see it, and they're going to understand that, yo, that's poetry? I had no idea. You know what I'm saying? That's what blew a lot of us away with Def Poetry. That was like a huge access point for a generation, because we had no idea that poetry could be like that. And for someone like me that had already been reading and writing poetry on my own, not knowing about the spoken word, I mean, knowing about like some of the history of like the Watts Prophets and like the influence on hip hop and things like that, but never understanding what Def Poetry showed me, that is huge. And what we're trying to do, what we're trying to teach poets how to do, is how do you make content that can compete, and not compete in the sense of we're trying to push out the next Avengers movie, because that's never going to happen. But yeah, but if we can, and that is a good point, David, I'll come right back to that, because if we can get the 15-year-old kid on his phone to watch the Avengers trailer and then watch the next Pen Click poetry class trailer and be equally engaged in both, right, then that leads the paradigm to start to shift. And eventually, 50 years, 100 years, 10 years down the line, who knows, right? The American paradigm on poetry could be so that instead of buying Kendrick is touring with 2 spoken word poets, or instead of going to see Kendrick, you're going to see Brandon, you know what I'm saying? And you're going to pay that $80 to see this poetry show, because it has all the lights and all the bells and all the whistles that media has put into hip hop, that media puts into music, that media puts into television, right there on stage. So if we start that, it's a long battle, and it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of grassroots work right now. But that's really what we're trying to do, is show the poetry community, like, yo, your content can look like an Avengers trailer, B, for reals. It can. And it can be dope. And then your poem, your 30-second poem piece that's in that Avengers trailer looks extra dope. And now the kid that loves poetry has something to show his homie with sticky fingers that's caught in the trap. You know what I'm saying? Like, now he has something to show him, to be like, yo, but look at this. This is dope too. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that really is the mission. Change people's thinking about poetry by making content that could visually compete. That's good. Kelsey, what do you think?
And then, like, if this was the poetry, if this was Pen Click's poetry podcast, you hear like, and then you see flames all coming out. Dang, we really got to get season 3 cracking.